Hi everybody, and welcome to this second installment of the Told in Stone Q&A, in which I answer viewer questions about all things Greek and Roman. So I have, 5 questions today. I have many more on the docket, but if you have more questions of your own, or want me to elaborate here on my answers, please don't hesitate to tell me in the comments, and I'll do what I can to answer them. So, today's first question is from Ryan Kidd, who wants to know, were barbarian fashions ever used as counterculture in the Roman Empire? Well, that's a fun question. The most famous example of barbarian fashion going mainstream is, of course, pants, or trousers to our British friends. These, of course, were the height of barbarism for those good robe-wearing Mediterranean people, but they crept in gradually over the course of the Roman imperial era, thanks to soldiers in colder northern climates like Britain or Germany wearing them, initially just as cavalry, but finally as a brachii, breeches, basically, part of their standard uniform. We see them on Trajan's Column, for example, and other visual media. So by late antiquity, as soldiers moved into government more and more openly and stridently, their trousers came with them and became mainstream in even senatorial dress by late antiquity. That's not exactly counterculture, however, nor are things like barbarian fibulae, which we find in many tombs of late antiquity. Perhaps the best example of barbarian-esque fashions being flaunted in the Roman world appears in late antiquity, when Procopius, writing in the reign of Justinian, that is in the 6th century AD, tells us that fans of certain hippodrome factions, that is, of the guys who race the chariots around in Constantinople's arena, would wear outlandish hairstyles modeled on those of the Huns, the most fearsome, of course, of the steppe barbarians. The way Procopius describes these hairstyles, it sounds awful like a mullet. So business up front, party in the back, probably some ringlets thrown in there, and some other barbarian touches. But anyway, so at least in this instance, dressing barbarian was being daring, countercultural, youthful, etc. Our next question. Where did the Romans get the fuel, that is, oil and wood, to heat the city of Rome? This comes from Scipionia Studios. Now, I should say at the outset that oil is not used for heating, really, in the Roman world. It's used, above all, for cooking and lighting. But it is imported for those reasons in massive quantities, above all, we think, from Spain and North Africa. A fun aside, there's a gargantuan heap of amphorae, oil amphorae from Spain, called Monte Testaccio, that's near the old docks along the Tiber. It's a gargantuan heap from the 2nd century AD, mostly, still about 150 feet high in places, testifies to the scale of oil importation in the Imperial Roman world. But your question's about heating, and heating was mostly from wood and charcoal. Now, obviously, a city the size of Rome, with 1 million people, has gargantuan demands for wood and charcoal, which cannot be satisfied by just Rome's hinterland. And we don't know a whole lot about how this trade was organized. We know that some wood, large pieces of wood, beams, for example, were imported in some cases from very far away. There was a discovery a few years ago of beams preserved in a waterlogged environment, which had come, it was proved, all the way from what is now northern France, which is pretty incredible. We think, though, that wood for fuel, just short lengths of wood, charcoal, is probably coming mostly from Italy, just for reasons of cost. It's not a very expensive thing. You wouldn't want to import something that was so cheap from far away. And so we think it comes from central Italy for the most part, probably along the Tiber and Anio valleys. And although we don't know, we assume it's mostly managed by something called coppicing, that is, forest management in such a way that you cut a tree and encourage it to develop in almost like a bush-like structure with many upright poles. And you harvest a coppiced grove once every 15 or 20 years. But because it's managed in this way, it grows pretty rapidly, and does not have to be replanted or clear-cut. So we assume there are all kinds of coppiced groves around central Italy, which are managed by teams of people and shipped either as wood or as charcoal down to Rome to eat the baths and all those other luxury buildings in the city. I should note, however, that there was deforestation, we think on a pretty massive scale. There's evidence of massive silting on the Tiber, for example, caused, we assume, by people cutting too many trees in the uplands, in the upstream part of the Tiber. And actually, this deforestation caused the development of these large silt flats around Ostia above all, and caused malaria to become an increasingly pressing problem for the Romans in the late Empire. But that's for a different video, a different topic. Third question of the day, from Maximilian Brandt, is about Roman measuring units. What were they? How did they work? Well, I can only give you kind of a brief overview because I don't remember all of them, but briefly, the chief unit of length, or the most familiar one, is the Roman foot, the pes, plural is pedes. That was a bit shorter than our foot, than the imperial foot, based, we think, by the way, on Charlemagne's foot, which had some pretty plus-sized feet. The Roman foot was, we think, I think 0.97 English feet, something like that, about the same as the English foot. 5 Roman feet made up a passus, a pace. That's longer than a meter or yard. It's something like, 5 of our feet, so kind of a great leaping stride. And 1,000 passus, 5,000 Roman feet, made up the mille passus, that is the Roman mile. A Roman mile was about 9/10, I think 0.93 or something, of the English or imperial mile. So those are the miles marked on the milestones we see on the great Roman roads. For area, the main unit is the jugerum, which means the yoke, essentially. The idea was there's this amount of land that could be plowed by a yoke of oxen in a single day. And it was not very large, only, I think, about 6/10 of an acre. And I know that isn't a hectare, some metric person should tell me that. So that was the jugerum. That could be combined with things like a saltus, which is an estate, but surveyors marked out farms in terms of their jugera. For liquid measurement, you're talking about the congius, and the congius is a bit less than a gallon, I think about 7/10 of a gallon, which would be a bit more than 3 liters. For dry measurement, we actually find these artifacts, which are measuring cups, essentially, for this. This is the modius. So grain is measured in modii. And a modius is about 2 gallons. For the pound, finally, the measurement of weight, we have we find yard arm weights, which are in Roman pounds still. The libra, Roman pound, is about 3/4 of an English or imperial pound. So, Maximilian, I hope that answers your question very briefly. There's some fun tables online that allow you to do conversions of these things. Just a Frog wants to know, how did the Greeks build cities? This is an excuse to talk about urban planning, one of my favorite topics. Now, the earliest Greek cities are not planned at all. They grow organically, often over the ruins of Mycenaean predecessors. So Athens, for example, is, even in its classical heyday, a rather ramshackle series of streets and neighborhoods that grow up around the Acropolis, the natural fortification that rears up from the Attic plain. Now, Sparta is even less monumental, as Thucydides famously mentions. Sparta was only 5 villages that were located near each other, and with no real monumental center until the Hellenistic and, above all, Roman periods. Town planning, as we know it, is a creation of the Greek colonization period, that is, the Archaic period, the 7th and 6th centuries BC. And that's because you have these colonists, often a few thousand at a time, going out to these new lands, and they have to allot lands. They have to apportion lots within a city. And that means surveying it and laying out an orderly grid of streets and lots, which is done first in Magna Graecia, modern southern Italy and Sicily, and then elsewhere in the Greek colonial world. This idea that an orderly street grid is a good idea is transferred to the Greek motherland gradually in the classical period, above all by the famous Hippodamus of Miletus, the first urban planner. Hippodamus, as his name suggests, comes from Miletus, which was burned by the Persians during the Ionian Revolt, the first stage of the Persian Wars. And he helps rebuild his mother city in this organized, lovely grid plan, which he translates other cities later in life, above all Piraeus, the harbor town of Athens, which is the first real famous planned city in Greece proper. Other examples include Thurii in southern Italy later on. But our image of the classical city, with its gleaming colonnades, its marble monuments, etc., is really more of a later product, a product of the Hellenistic and above all Roman eras, when there was much more money floating around, and this thing called euergetism, the habit of wealthy elites, rather the expectation that wealthy elites would give part of their fortunes to their cities, and in this form of monuments, would endow their hometowns with these great glowing buildings. So the short answer is, in short, that Greek urban planning develops very gradually, and is really more a product of the later, more luxurious period than the classical period itself. Finally, in our title question, comes from Council of the Wise, who says, in the first book of Maccabees, it's claimed that the Jews and the Spartans are related. Could you explore this? Now, I have to admit, I had never heard this before. I had never carefully read the book of Maccabees, I guess, and so I had to do a bit of background reading on this, and I'm glad I did. It's a fascinating story. But before I do, a bit of backstory on the Maccabees in general. Now, as you may know, there are several books of Maccabees. How many there are depends on which Bible you read, or where it's shuffled in the Apocrypha, or whatever else. But all the books of Maccabees, however apocryphal or not, describe the revolt of the Maccabees, the Maccabee brothers, the five of whom were the sons of Mattathias, a rural priest in Judea who led a revolt against the Syrian Greek kings. Now, as you may know, ancient Judea was sandwiched between two of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucids, who were based in what's now Syria, but governed much of the Middle East. So you're talking what's now Iraq, Iran, into Central Asia for at least some periods. And the Ptolemies, who governed both Egypt and bits of what is now Syrio-Palestine. And so these two great kingdoms had their interface, their disputed borders, between right around where modern Israel is. And Jerusalem and Judea were shuttled back and forth between the two great kingdoms. Now, around the beginning of the 2nd century BC, there were factions among the Jewish elite who disputed how Hellenized they should become. And one faction, led by the high priests Jason and Menelaus, who, as their name suggests, were quite Hellenized, supported Hellenization and had the allegiance for that region, had the support, rather, of Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king. They were opposed by more fundamentalist factions, which preferred to keep Judea more Jewish and apart from the cultural and political orbit of the Greek kingdom of the Seleucids. This broke out into open war in the 160s BC, with King Antiochus supporting the Hellenizing factions among the Jews. Eventually, the more nativist faction, the anti-Greek faction, found its leaders in the Maccabees, these five brothers who established eventually a kingdom, but began as rebels, opposing the Greeks and eventually clearing Jerusalem of its garrison. Now, the Maccabees, I think it's the third Maccabee brother, who is Jonathan, around the 160 BC, he sent an embassy to several Mediterranean powers. First, the Roman Republic, and then the kingdom, I suppose we should call it, the state of Sparta, in a bid to gain support for his very tenuous political rule. And we have, in the first book of Maccabees, chapter 12, a description of this embassy that goes to Sparta, and in which it is expressed that the Spartans had once sent a letter to the Jewish kingdom stating that they were related, they were brothers, that the Spartans had found some document saying that the Spartans too were sons of Abraham. Now, this is almost certainly a claim made, if it was made at all, only in the interest of diplomacy. There's no source we know of that connects the Spartans and the Jews in any way, but the fact that the claim is made at all is very interesting, and it speaks to what we call kinship diplomacy, an ancient custom in which two peoples that might have nothing to do with each other claim to be related via very distant ancestors. It's a way of saying that, hey, we should be friends now because our great times umpteen whatever grandparents were related, were brothers, were cousins, or were really good buddies. And in this case, if King Arius of Sparta ever did send a letter to that effect to the Maccabi kings, that was the purpose. The most famous instance of this happening is, of course, Aeneas. He's this legendary Trojan prince who flees to Italy and then founds the line of kings who eventually spawn Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. This is a handy way for the Romans to tie themselves to the world of Greek myth and to the Greeks themselves via fictive ancestry. So no one probably believed in either Sparta or Jerusalem that the Jews and the Spartans were related, but the claim was made, apparently, or possibly, at least once, because it was useful. And it speaks to the interconnectedness of the classical world, where the king of this small Judean kingdom can try and tie himself to the legendary Spartan state and its ancestry. So, that'll do it for today. 5 questions, some wonderful questions from the subscribers. If you have your own questions, please send them in, and I'll be happy to add them to the list and answer them in due course. In the meantime, check out both other videos on this channel, my main channel, Told in Stone, and thanks so much for watching.